It's that easy, Dom. All I got to do is press this thing here.
That's what they told me on my wedding night. I did get the hang of it.
Last of the Summer Wine ran for 295 episodes, and only one man was in every single one of them. His name was Peter Sallis. He played Norman Clegg, and by the end he had spent 37 years walking the same Yorkshire hills. One other man wrote all 295 of those episodes on his own, and what happened to him this year is the best thing in this video. So stay with me, because I am keeping it for the end. Peter Sallis was born on the 1st of February 1921 in Twickenham, and he did not begin anywhere near a stage. He began in a bank. That is where the war found him. He joined the Royal Air Force, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, he was put in front of an audience for the first time and discovered what he was actually for. When it was over, he went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in his middle 20s, having already lost the years most actors use to get themselves started. He was not a young man in a hurry. He was a late arrival who had worked out exactly what he wanted. What he came out with is the thing that made Clegg possible: a voice. That flat, unhurried, faintly mournful northern delivery, capable of saying something quietly devastating about human nature while apparently discussing a garden gate. Clegg is the one who never quite commits, who talks himself out of every adventure and then goes along on it anyway, and Sallis played him for 37 years without once letting him curdle into a wet blanket. That is much harder than it looks, and here is why. The entire programme is three men walking and talking. There is no office, no family, no set of regular jokes to fall back on. If the talking is not funny, there is nothing else on the screen at all. Somebody has to be the still point that the other two bounce off, and it has to be somebody the audience is content to spend half an hour with, week after week, for the better part of 4 decades. That was his job, and almost nobody noticed him doing it, which is the highest compliment you can pay that kind of performance, and none of it was supposed to happen. The whole thing started as a single pilot episode in 1973, 1/2 hour, made to see whether anybody wanted it. Nobody involved was building an institution. They were making one programme about 3 men with nothing to do, in a town most of the country could not have found on a map. And the expectation was that it would be shown once and forgotten. Peter Sallis turned up for that pilot and did not stop turning up until 2010. Something else about him that is worth saying, because it explains why he lasted. He never tried to be the funny one. In a programme where the other two are permitted to fall in rivers and roll down hills, Clegg mostly stands there and comments. And an actor with any vanity at all would have found that unbearable within about 3 years. Sallis did it for 37. And he did it without ever once pulling focus, and that is a kind of discipline you cannot teach. He was there at the very beginning in 1973. He was there at the end in 2010. He is the only one who managed it. 295 episodes without missing one. Nobody in British comedy has done anything remotely like it. Every other face in this video arrived or left or came back again. Clegg was simply always there at the end of the row, saying something dry. And then there is the other thing, which is the reason people who have never watched a minute of this programme still know exactly who he was. In the 1980s, a young animator named Nick Park was making a short film about an inventor and his dog, and he needed a voice for the inventor. He wanted Peter Sallis, not somebody like him. Him. First choice, no discussion, no audition process worth mentioning. And so the man from the Yorkshire hillside became Wallace and won Academy Awards doing it, right through to the full-length picture The Curse of the Were-Rabbit in 2005. Think about the reach of that for a moment. There are children in 100 countries who have never heard of Compo and could pick that voice out of a crowded room instantly. The cheese, the crackers, the wrong trousers. It is precisely the same instrument he used to talk about Nora Batty's stockings, simply pointed in a completely different direction. He kept working into his 80s, and he went on recording Wallace long after the hills themselves had got beyond him. Peter Sallis died on the 2nd of June 2017, at his home in Northwood in London, at the age of 96. What he leaves is a strange double legacy. The quietest man in the longest-running sitcom in the world, and one of the best-loved voices in the history of British animation, and both of them were the same fellow in a flat cap. The next one is buried within sight of the hills you watched him running down, and he asked for it himself. Compo Simonite. Second in this, and for a great many of you, he is the reason you clicked. He was born William John Owen Rowbotham on the 14th of March 1914 at Acton Green in London. And yes, London, which is the first surprise for anyone who watched him for 26 years and quietly assumed he had been dug out of a Holmfirth allotment. His father drove a tram and was a committed man of the left, and Bill Owen carried those politics his whole life, openly, in an industry that has not always rewarded it. His war was not a comfortable one. He served with the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, and he was injured in an explosion during a battle training course, hurt in training in his own country before he ever got near the enemy. It is the sort of thing that happened to a great many men of that generation and that almost none of them talked about afterwards. He came out of it and built a proper film career. He was in Johnny in the Clouds in 1945. He was in When the Bow Breaks in 1947 and Maniacs on Wheels in 1949. He was in Walt Disney's The Story of Robin Hood and His Merry Men in 1952. This is a working screen actor with 25 years behind him before Last of the Summer Wine was even an idea. And here is the part almost nobody knows. Bill Owen was a songwriter. A real one, professionally, and among the artists who recorded his material was Cliff Richard. The man in the wrinkled Wellingtons, rolling down a hillside inside a bathtub, wrote songs for the biggest pop star in the country. Which brings me to the thing worth understanding about Compo. It was a performance, and a fearless one. Owen was a trained, disciplined actor in his late 50s when the series began, and he chose to spend the remainder of his life covered in mud for other people's amusement. He never once protected his own dignity, and that is exactly why the character works. You cannot half-play Compo. You have to be willing to look completely ridiculous in front of the entire country week after week for a quarter of a century, and most actors of his standing simply would not do it. Away from the camera, he was doing something else entirely. In 1976, Bill Owen was appointed MBE. Not for the acting, but for years of work with the National Association of Boys Clubs and for chairing the Performing Arts Advising Panel. So while the nation was laughing at a scruffy old man in a woolly hat, the actor inside it was spending his own time on other people's children. There is a contradiction in him that I find hard to get past. Here is a man who spent his own time chairing panels and running clubs for boys who had very little, who had strong politics and held them in public, who wrote songs that got recorded by serious artists, and who is remembered by an entire nation for a hat, a pair of Wellingtons, and an unrequited passion for a woman with wrinkled stockings. He could have played it grudgingly. Plenty would have. Instead, he went at it with everything he had, and the reason Compo is loved rather than pitied is entirely down to the seriousness with which Bill Owen refused to be serious. He also fell in love with the place. Not in the way people say that in interviews. Properly. Holmfirth became his town, and its people became his people, and when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, he made his wishes perfectly clear. Bill Owen died on the 12th of July 1999 in Westminster at the age of 85. He was buried in the churchyard of St John's Parish Church at Upperthong, on the hillside above Holmfirth. In the middle of the countryside, he had spent 26 years walking across. A Londoner, a socialist and a songwriter, resting in a Yorkshire village because he asked to be. And then something happened that I still find genuinely moving. The programme did not simply write Compo out and carry on. His son Tom Owen joined the cast, playing Compo's long-lost son. The gap the father left in that series was filled on screen by his own boy. There are not many television programmes that would even think of it, and fewer still that could have carried it off. The third man on that hill did his most famous work inside a prison, and when the time came for him to go, he chose his own replacement. Foggy Dewhurst is next, and Brian Wilde is the one who turned 3 men walking into an engine. He was born on the 13th of June 1927, and he had one of those faces British television could not do without for 40 years. Long, weary, permanently braced for disappointment. What he did with Foggy was find the programme's missing piece. Blamire had been a snob. Foggy was something better and funnier, a small, cautious, physically unimpressive man who genuinely believed himself to be a warrior and who described his own military exploits in a tone that never once acknowledged the enormous gap between the story and the storyteller. The comedy of it is beautifully cruel and never actually cruel at all because Wilde plays the belief as sincere. Foggy is not lying to the other two, he's lying to himself, and he has been doing it so long that it has become load-bearing. That character gave the other two something to push against for years, and it is no coincidence that most people's favourite era of the programme is the one with him in the middle of it. Before that, though, and this is the surprise, Brian Wilde had already created one of the best-loved characters in British comedy, and it had nothing to do with Yorkshire. He was Mr. Barrowclough in Porridge, the soft, decent, hopelessly ineffective prison officer, endlessly outmanoeuvred by Ronnie Barker's Fletcher and quietly kinder than the job permitted him to be. If you sat down and made a list of the finest supporting performances in British sitcom, Barrowclough and Foggy would both be on it, and the same man did both of them. He left last of the summer wine in the 1990s, and here is the detail that tells you what sort of man he was. When the production needed somebody to take his place in the trio, it was Wilde himself who suggested the actor they ought to get. He did not sulk, and he did not vanish. He handed the part on personally, which in this business is rarer than it should be. Brian Wilde had a fall and he did not recover from it, and he died on the 20th of March 2008 at the age of 80. What he leaves behind is two of the best-loved cowards in British comedy, played with such precision and such affection that neither of them was ever once held in contempt. The next name in this story is not the one on her birth certificate, and the woman who owned it spent 35 years being the most feared person in Yorkshire. Nora Batty. The stockings, the doorstep, the broom. Her name was Cathy Staff, except that it was not. She was born Minnie Higginbottom on the 12th of July 1928 in Dukenfield in Cheshire, and she went into touring repertory companies in 1946 under the name Catherine Brandt. When she married John Staff in 1951, she took his surname for the stage, and that is the name the country came to know. Then she stopped. She left the stage to raise her family, which in that era usually meant leaving for good, and for years that is exactly what it looked like. She came back in the 1960s the hard way, as an extra at Granada Television in Manchester. Not a leading lady returning to her rightful place. A woman in her 30s standing in the background of other people's scenes, working her way up again from nothing. That is worth remembering the next time you see Nora Batty planted in that doorway looking utterly immovable. Every bit of it was earned twice. She played Vera Hopkins in Coronation Street from September 1973 to February 1975, and then she left the biggest programme on British television, voluntarily, to concentrate on three old men wandering about on a hillside. It looked like a strange decision at the time. It turned out to be one of the best calls anybody in this story ever made. She also played Mrs. Blewett in Open All Hours between 1976 and 1981, which means she was in two of Roy Clarke's series at once. And remember that name because he is where all of this ends. What she built out of Nora Batty is remarkable, because on paper the part is nothing whatsoever. A woman who stands at the top of some stone steps and shouts at a scruffy man. That is the entire part. And Cathy Staff turned it into one of the most instantly recognisable images in British popular culture. The folded arms, the pinny, the wrinkled stockings, the look of complete weariness at the sight of Compo coming up the path. The trick, and it is a very good one, is that Nora never actually hated him. Watch it again. There is something underneath the whole thing, a sort of exasperated fondness she never once puts into words, and the entire 26-year joke depends on Staff letting you see it while never admitting to it. There is one more thing about that partnership worth noticing. Compo and Nora are, between them, the longest-running unconsummated love story in British television, and neither character ever says a word about it that could be taken seriously. It is all broom handles and slammed doors for 26 years, and yet when Bill Owen died and Compo was gone, the programme could not simply carry on as though the doorstep had never mattered. It had mattered. Two performers had built something real out of a running gag purely by refusing to play it as one. She was there from the pilot in 1973 and she stayed until 2008, 245 episodes. While we are here, I would like to ask you something, and I mean it. What do you remember about watching this programme? The Sunday evening it went out, the person you watched it with, the hills, the theme music starting up over them. Tell me in the comments. The answers underneath these videos are always better than anything I can write, and on this one especially I would like to know. Cathy Staff died on the 13th of December 2008 at Ashton-under-Lyne in Greater Manchester of a brain tumour. She was 80. What she leaves behind is the proof of something this program understood better than almost any other, that a small part, played by somebody who takes it entirely seriously, will outlive a great many large ones. The next one had already spent years being the most self-important man in a London department store, and the man he replaced on that hillside is the one who put his name forward. Fifth, and if you have been on this channel before, you know this face extremely well indeed. Frank Thornton was Captain Peacock, Grace Brothers, the floor walker, the moustache, the eyebrows, the voice of a man permanently addressing somebody slightly beneath him. For a whole generation, he simply was, "Are you being served?" And if you watched our video about that cast, you have already spent half an hour in his company. And then, in 1997, he walked into Last of the Summer Wine and became Herbert Truelove, truly of the yard, the retired policeman with a bottomless supply of stories about his former wife and the air of a man who has already seen everything there is to see. He got the part because Brian Wilde suggested him for it. One great British sitcom actor handing the baton to another, off-screen, quietly, with no fuss made about it at the time and very little made of it since. What is genuinely fascinating is how differently he played the two. Peacock is all posture. His whole existence is the pretense of authority, and he deflates the instant anybody senior walks onto the floor. Truly is the exact opposite. Truly really was a policeman, really does know things, and delivers every bit of it in a flat, patient tone, suggesting the world stopped being able to surprise him sometime around 1974. Same actor, same era of television, two completely different kinds of Englishmen, and he was good enough that he did not simply fill a gap. He shifted the balance of the trio. With Foggy, the comedy came from delusion. With Truly, it comes from competence. A man who is genuinely more capable than his two companions and has decided, for reasons of his own, to spend his retirement wandering about with them anyway. And consider the arithmetic of it, because it is quietly astonishing. He joined at 76. He stayed 13 years. That is a longer run than most actors get in a hit program at any age, and he began it at a point in life when the majority of people in any profession have long since handed the keys back. There is not much in British television more encouraging than that, and if you are somewhere north of 70 yourself and watching this, I would say it is worth remembering. He stayed to the very last episode in 2010, which means Frank Thornton was present at the end of two of the longest-running comedies this country has ever produced. He died in his sleep in London on the 16th of March 2013 at the age of 92. What he leaves behind is a rare thing in this business. A second great part found in his late 70s in a programme that was already 24 years old when he joined it. The next one won the country's biggest acting award 3 separate times, and one of those times she beat Maggie Smith to it. Sixth on the list, and one of the genuine giants of British television, Edie Pegden in The Immaculate Car with the Immaculate Driving. Thora Hurd was born on the 28th of May 1911 in Morecambe. That is not a misprint. She was born before the First World War, and she was still doing extraordinary work in the 21st century, and there are very few people in this business about whom you can say that. She had been famous for decades before she came anywhere near Holmfirth, a fixture of British film and television from the 1940s onwards. And then, remarkably, in her 70s and 80s, she did the finest work of her entire life. In 1988, Alan Bennett wrote a monologue for the BBC called A Cream Cracker Under the Settee, part of the Talking Heads series. Thora Hurd plays Doris, an old woman who has had a fall while cleaning her own house and lies on the floor talking about her husband, her obsession with dusting, and everything she has lost. It is half an hour of one woman on a floor, and it is one of the most devastating things British television has ever broadcast. The BAFTA for Best Actress went to her that year, and the two performances she was up against were Patricia Routledge's and Dame Maggie Smith's. She did it again for Waiting for the Telegram in 1999, and again for Lost for Words in 2000. 3 BAFTA Best Actress awards, the first of them collected at 78 and the last at 89. She was appointed OBE in 1983, and a decade after that she became Dame Thora Hurd. And with all of that behind her, she spent years driving Edie Pegden's beautifully polished car about 4 feet at a time, terrifying her passengers, playing the comedy dead straight. That is the mark of a serious performer. She never condescended to it. She turned up and did it properly in a program about 3 old men on a hill because she thought the writing deserved it. And she was right, and if you doubt it, the man who wrote it is at the end of this video. Dame Thora Hurd died on the 15th of March 2003 in Twickenham following a stroke at the age of 91. What she leaves behind is the argument, settled for good, that the best years of a performer's life are not necessarily the early ones. The next 3 spent 25 years running the most badly kept secret in Yorkshire, and one of them was pouring the tea. 7th in this, and I am putting them together because the programme did. There is a version of Last of the Summer Wine that is only 3 men on a hill. It is not the version that ran for 37 years. What kept it going was the town underneath the hill, and the town had a cafe and a marriage and an affair that everybody in it knew about. Start with the cafe. Jane Freeman played Ivy, who ran it, and who was less a waitress than a form of weather. Ivy could clear a room with a tea towel. What Freeman understood, and this is the same understanding Kathy Staff had about Nora, is that the character is only funny if she is genuinely formidable. A pretend battle axe is nothing. Ivy actually frightens people, and that is why you laugh. She was there from the beginning in 1973, and she was still there for the last episode in 2010, which puts her among the very small handful who saw the whole thing through from end to end. Jane Freeman died of lung cancer on the 9th of March 2017. She was 81 and she went less than 3 months before Peter Sallis. 2 of the 4 people who had been there since the first series went within a season of each other. Then, the marriage. Robert Fife played Howard, and Juliet Kaplan played Pearl, his wife, and Jan Ferguson played Marina, the woman Howard was forever failing to have an affair with. 25 years of ladders, bicycles, whispered arrangements behind hedges, and a wife who knew precisely what was going on the entire time. It is a very old joke, and they made it work for a quarter of a century, which nobody should be able to do. The trick is in Kaplan's performance. Pearl is not a fool being deceived. Pearl is a woman with total information who has decided that catching him properly would be more trouble than it is worth, and who therefore torments him instead. Once you see it that way, every one of those scenes gets funnier and slightly sadder at the same time. Juliet Kaplan died in 2019, at 80. Jan Ferguson died the same year. Robert Fife outlasted them both. He died on the 15th of September 2021 at the age of 90. What those 4 leave behind is the reason the programme did not run out of material. 3 Men Walking will carry you perhaps 4 series. A whole town with a cafe and a feud and a marriage nobody can escape from will carry you 37 years. The next one was there before every face you have just met. And he is the reason there was ever a second series at all. 7th, and the man most people have forgotten, was in it. Cyril Blamire. Michael Bates was born on the 4th of December 1920, and he was the original 3rd man on that hill. The first trio was Clegg, Compo and Blamire was the pompous one, the ex-serviceman who looked down on the other 2 and could not for the life of him understand how he had ended up in their company. It is the same slot Foggy and then Truly would later fill, and Bates is the one who worked out what the slot was for. He was in the first 2 series, 1973 to 1975, and then he was gone. Bates was a very fine and very versatile character actor, and if you want proof of his range, go and look at 1971. He is the chief prison guard in A Clockwork Orange, the one who processes Alex on arrival. A performance of such barking, contemptuous precision that people who saw the film once, decades ago, still remember him in it. There is not a trace of comedy in it. It is frightening. What Bates gives the early episodes is friction of a particular kind. Blamire does not merely disagree with the other 2. He is embarrassed to be seen with them. He is a man who believes he has come down in the world and is being reminded of it every afternoon by a scruffy little chap in a woolly hat. That is a sharper, colder joke than the programme would later run on, and there are people who prefer those first 2 series precisely because of it. He became ill and he did not come back, and Michael Bates died of cancer in Chelsea on the 11th of January 1978. He was 57, which makes him by a long way the youngest loss in this story, and he is the only one of these people who never got to see what the thing he helped start would turn into. He died when the series was 2 years old. It had another 32 years to run. It is worth sitting with that for a second because it changes how you watch the early episodes. When you see Blamire on that hillside, you are watching a man who has perhaps 4 years to live, and no idea that the small program he is standing in will still be going when the people watching it have grandchildren of their own. He is the only one of them who got none of it. No long run, no affection from a whole country, no seat at the end. Just 2 series and then out. But because the trio had to be rebuilt after him, the programme discovered something about itself. It could survive losing a face. That single discovery is the reason it lasted until 2010 through Foggy and Truly and everything in between. Michael Bates leaves behind the first version of something that outlived him by more than 3 decades. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, do think about subscribing because there is one person left in this story and he is the only one still here. Which brings me finally to the man I promised you at the start. Every one of those 295 episodes was written by a single person. Not a team, not a writer's room, one man at a desk for 37 years. His name is Roy Clarke and he was born on the 28th of January 1930 in Yorkshire. He did not begin as a writer either. None of the people in this story took the direct route to anything. He came to it late, after entirely different jobs, and then produced a body of work very few people in the history of British television can match. Last of the Summer Wine is only the start of it. He also created Keeping Up Appearances, which gave the world Hyacinth Bucket. He created Open All Hours and still Open All Hours after it. If you sat down tonight and listed the British sitcoms your family still quotes at each other, a startling number of them came out of the same head. And notice how the story keeps folding back on itself. Kathy Staff was in Open All Hours while she was being Nora Batty. Frank Thornton had another life in another long-running comedy entirely. These people kept turning up in each other's programmes for 40 years because the pool of performers who could do this properly was never very large. Now here is what I have been holding back. In the 2026 New Year Honours at the age of 96, Roy Clarke was knighted for services to entertainment. He went to Windsor Castle and came home as Sir Roy Clarke. 50-odd years after he sat down to write about 3 old men with nothing left to do but wander about the hills, this country finally said the thing out loud. And think about what writing it alone actually meant. 37 years is longer than most marriages and most careers. Over that time, he had to keep finding new things for the same 3 men to do. Then rebuild the trio when an actor left, then rebuild it again, then keep the cafe and the marriage and the feud alive around them, and do it without a single co-writer to hand the difficult week to. British television has produced nothing else like that, and it is fairly safe to say it never will again because nobody commissions that way anymore. He is still with us. Of everybody in this video, he is the one who got to see all of it. The whole 37 years, the actors who arrived and the ones who left, the town that turned into a place people travelled to on purpose, and then, in his 10th decade, a sword on his shoulder. So that is the story of the longest-running sitcom in the world. It was made out of hills and walking and 3 men with time on their hands, and it had no business lasting 37 years. And it did. Peter Sallis was in every episode of it and went away to be Wallace. Bill Owen threw away every scrap of his dignity and asked to be buried on that hillside. Brian Wilde gave us a coward for the ages and then chose his own successor. Kathy Staff built something immortal out of a doorstep, having started again from nothing in her 30s. Frank Thornton found a second great part at 76. Thora Hurd did her finest work after 70. Michael Bates began it and never saw where it went. And the man who wrote every word for all of them is 96 years old and has just been knighted. And there is one last thing they had in common which you may have noticed as we went. Almost none of them arrived by the front door. A bank clerk who found acting in the RAF. A tram driver's son who wrote pop songs. A woman who started again from nothing as an extra in her 30s. A man who came to writing late after other jobs entirely. Not one of these people was marked out early as somebody special. They simply kept going and they took the work seriously when it arrived, and between them they made the longest-running comedy programme on earth out of 3 men, a hillside and a cafe. Next time it comes on, watch the first minute of the theme, the camera coming down over those hills before anybody has said a word. That was the promise the programme made every single week for 37 years, and it kept it every time. Not bad for 3 old men with nowhere in particular to go.